This brings us to the fifth and final point. When At-Tahawi said, "La ka'ahadin min al-wara." So he began by affirming the attributes, "Wallahu yaghdabu wa yarda, la ka'ahadin min al-wara," which means at the end, but not like any from the creation. Now what we find then is these attributes, like anger and pleasure, we see that when we see them in a human, we see them being manifested in a certain way, right? We physically observe a person, we can see that there are signs of pleasure, right? Which indicate that the attribute of pleasure is with him. There are signs of anger, which shows that the signs of anger are actually with him now, right? And it takes on a certain form because of what we can see. And as for Allah Azza wa Jal, then His pleasure, His anger, His love, then again that is appropriate and suitable to Allah Azza wa Jal, appropriate to His essence. And so this issue really comes down to the essence of each thing, the actual being of each thing. The attributes follow on from the reality of the essence, the reality of the being, right? So as a human, when we look at a human, we see that these various attributes, we see them manifest in certain ways. Why? Because we are made the way we are, and so when we look at the essences, Allah's essence is unlike the essence of the creation. His essence is the loftiest of essences, the loftiest of beings. As for man, his essence is from the lowliest, from the low. It is haqira, wadi'a, it is low. In terms of its weakness, in terms of its, just the creation itself. So we cannot compare between the essence of Allah Azza wa Jal and the essences of all other things. There is no likeness between them. And because of that, then therefore there can be no likeness in any of the attributes or in any of the actions. There's no likeness between our knowledge and the knowledge of Allah Azza wa Jal, between our mercy and the mercy of Allah Azza wa Jal, our speech and the speech of Allah, and so on and so forth. So there's some discussion here basically about words and their meanings, and I'll just really summarize the discussion. So basically, the discussion comes down to this, which is that just because we have a similarity in wording, in the words, it does not mean that the realities are the same. Right? This is a principle that Shaykh al-Islam Ibn Taymiyyah mentions as well in At-Tadmuriyah, that the reality, that the similarity in the wording and the meaning, in the attribute, the similarity of the wording and the meaning does not mean that the reality behind it is the same, right? For example, we say life, hayat, life. There are many things which have life. Fish have life, animals have life, snails have life, flies, insects have life, right? And humans have life, angels have life, jinn have life, right? So in that word, when we take that word hayat and we look at the meaning as well, even amongst all of these things, you can see that there are clear differences, right? The life of an eel in the ocean is different to the life of a human. Just like the life of a butterfly is different to the life of a lion or an animal, right? Because their essences are different. The nature of the life that they have, it varies. And even amongst the creation, there are some things which we know have life, but we are unable to fathom their life. For example, angels have life. Jinn have life. Now we can't fathom what the life of angels is like because we don't know the reality of their essences. Even though we've been told that they are made of light, We can't study them. We can't see them in the original form. We can't study them. We can't analyze the material or the essence. We don't know how their life is. We don't know how they speak, how they understand, compared to ourselves. With humans, we know that from our study of the human body, there is flesh, there is blood vessels, there are neurons, there is a brain, there is a tongue, there is lips, there is all of these things. We know how they basically function and how a human thinks, speaks, likes, dislikes. We understand that. But we know that the angels, they have the same attributes. They are living, they are hearing, they are seeing, they are speaking. How do they actually do this? We don't know. Because we do not know the reality of their essence. But the similarity in the wording and the meaning. We know what hearing means. We know what seeing means. We know what speaking means. Right? But when we look at these attributes in relation to a specific thing, these attributes take on specific forms. Right? So with an angel, it will be with a specific form. With a jinn, we don't really know. How do they actually hear and how do they see? Because we physically can't see them. We can't see them as having physical bodies like we have. Because the essence or the material which they are made of is unknown to us. And, but we know that they hear. We know that they speak. We know that they're able to think. But we can't see how are they actually made. We don't know. They don't have neurons in a brain and like what we have.
You don't say they are beings.
Allahu alim, we don't know. We don't know how the instrument of hearing works for them, the instrument of seeing works for them, the instrument of speech works for them. We don't know. We don't know that. But what we know is that there are certain meanings which are universal. Right? There are what we call universal meanings. Right? These meanings exist only in the mind. Right? For example, when you say knowledge, right? You understand what the meaning of knowledge is. Now, when you apply this word knowledge to a specific thing, then that word knowledge takes on a very specific reality, right? So, for example, the knowledge of a fly. Does a fly have knowledge? Can it, we don't know. Does a fly actually have knowledge? Is it able to retain, maybe just purely by the way Allah's created a fly or a worm, for example, maybe there is some knowledge which it retains, but maybe it's involuntary knowledge. It's not knowledge like we can, for example, learn facts and information and we can hold knowledge voluntarily, right? Right. So our knowledge now is taking on a slightly different form. It's a more perfect form of knowledge than, for example, let's say a cat has knowledge or a dog has knowledge, because the dog is able to retain knowledge of certain things. More so, for example, let's say, than a worm or a fly. Right? The worm or a fly can retain knowledge, but maybe that knowledge is not like voluntary. It's just inspired and programmed by Allah Azza wa Jal to behave the way that it behaves. But obviously there are certain, as we go, move further away, we see that there are other animals, there are cats, there are dogs, there are monkeys, and the ability, the notions of knowledge, whatever. So the point being from all of this, that we can think of a universal meaning in our minds. For example, life, as we've just given the example, and knowledge. Right? This is now a general idea in our minds, but it's not attached to anything. Right? This is what we call a universal meaning, which exists only in the mind. Right? Then, when we apply that meaning to a specific thing, then the reality of how that attribute is, how that meaning is unique only to that thing. Right? This means that the knowledge of a cat is not the same as the knowledge of a man. Right? And is not the same as the knowledge of a fly. There are clearly differences in the way that attribute is manifested in each of these different beings. Right? Now, if we can appreciate this between the creation, then to Allah belongs the loftiest example. Right? We cannot fathom how is Allah's knowledge, because we don't know His essence. Right? We know that in the creation, the essence of a fly or a worm is not the same as the essence of a whale or a human. Right? And the way that the knowledge is held, or if that concept exists for for some of these beings that we said, we know that it's different in each case. So in the same way, when we speak of knowledge, we can only think of knowledge in terms of how we see it is accessed, held, processed, conveyed, right? Because of the limitations of how we are created. That's how we would perceive knowledge to be, right? And because there is a limitation in our creation, right? That we, because we created in a certain way, it means that there's limits to our knowledge, right? We think of knowledge in terms of the brain. We think of knowledge in terms of storage on computers, right? Which have limitations. Because of what we experience and see in life, we can only think of knowledge in terms of those limited ways and forms, right? But as for Allah Azza wa Jal, we don't know His essence, and we know that His knowledge is perfect, right? So that knowledge will take on a completely different reality that we don't have any knowledge of. And so, just because the name is the same, the label is the same, the meaning is the same, right? Does not mean that the reality is the same, right? So the aslul ma'na, in fact, the Sheikh Salih al-Sheikh made a distinction before about the aslul ma'na, the basic meaning. So in the basic meaning, the meanings are the same. Like when we say knowledge of Allah, knowledge of man. Knowledge here in its base meaning, it's there has to be something shared. Otherwise, we could not know anything about Allah Azza wa Jal. Right? In these meanings, there has to be some shared meanings. But in the perfection of the meaning, then there is no comparison. Right? The meaning of knowledge for Allah is in its perfect form. The meaning of knowledge for the creation is in its imperfect, deficient form. There's no comparison between the two, right? In terms of the perfection. So the point being from all of this then is that we have universal meanings for attributes which we understand in our minds, and then when that attribute is spoken of in relation to a specific thing or a being, then it takes on a form that's unique to that particular being, right? And it does not mean that same attribute is the same in some other being. This does not follow rationally, or it doesn't follow. So that means really that there's no objection that these people can have towards the various attributes that we affirm, whether they are attributes, sifat, like we said, or whether they are actions of Allah Azza wa Jal, like anger and pleasure and love, and so on and so forth. So this point here will help us to understand the mistake that is made by these people, because they fail to grasp this specific point. And also, at the same time, they fall into a contradiction as well. Because why have you affirmed some attributes and denied the rest? If you can say Allah sees and hears and speaks, which is what the Ash'aris and Maturidis, they believe in, Allah hears, speaks, and He sees, then why can't you affirm that Allah becomes angry and becomes pleased? Because if you say, well, anger is something it's a human quality, well, so is seeing. Nothing that is able to see that we see in the creation sees except with limbs and organs and flesh and blood and whatever else is involved. It doesn't take place in the creation. So how come you can affirm seeing without claiming that it resembles the creation? It's a contradiction. And if you say, well, no, but it's a seeing, it's not like the creation. We'll say, well, likewise, Allah's anger is not like the creation. It's not like the creation, like that of the creation. Right? So they are inconsistent. The Ash'aris and Maturidis, they are the most contradictory in their stance. Right? So anyway, that concludes our discussion of these attributes, al-ghadab, wal-rida, and whatever is similar to them, of Allah's chosen actions. Any questions on that before we move on to the next statement, because that's the conclusion of that point.